Thank you for singing so well. You know, we have a wonderful worship team, but if you folks didn't join in, it wouldn't sound as good, so thank you. Suffering is something we do not like to focus on. But today, I'm inviting you to focus your thoughts and your attention to our suffering Savior. I remember, it's 4 years ago, that I had a physical crisis. I was sitting in my chair at home, and all of a sudden, I lost consciousness. My book that I was reading fell to the floor, and my wife started yelling at me, and I didn't hear her. And I came to, and I was a little shaky, and my daughter wanted to take me to the hospital. And so I grabbed hold of her shoulders to help me walk out to the car, and we went to the hospital. And in that hospital, I was there in that hospital for a few days, but in hospital total for 2 weeks. I had lost consciousness and coded blue over 40 times. And quite frankly, from my perspective, it didn't feel terrible because I was unconscious. But my wife had a hard time because she was watching the one she loved go through this health crisis. And this morning while we were having breakfast, I looked at my wife's face, and all of a sudden it turned painful and sorrowful. And I said, "Honey, are you okay?" And she said, "Yeah, I just had a flashback to what happened 4 years ago." And I could just see the pain on her face. Today I'm inviting you to go with me and to have a time of reflection on the pain of our suffering Savior. In Isaiah's, I almost called it Isaiah's Gospel, in Isaiah's book, Isaiah 53, you don't have to turn there, but we have a picture of the suffering servant. And Mark chapter 15, starting with verse 16, is actually the fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah 53. So I want you to read with me as I read from from Mark chapter 15 and starting with verse 16. And I'm reading from the Christian Standard Bible. The soldiers led him away into the palace, that is the governor's residence, and called the whole company together. They dressed him in a purple robe, twisted together a crown of thorns, and put it on him. And they began to salute him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They were hitting him on the head with a stick and spitting on him. "Get down from the cross," getting on their knees, they were paying him homage. After they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple robe and of his clothes on him. They led him out to crucify him. They forced a man coming in from the country who was passing by to carry Jesus' cross. He was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. They brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Then they crucified him and divided his clothes, casting lots for them to decide what each would get. Now it was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. An inscription of the charge written against him was, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 criminals with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by were yelling insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ha! The one who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself by coming down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests and their scribes were mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, so that we may see and believe." Even those who were crucified with him taunted him. May God bless this reading of his holy word. I want you to notice with me today five experiences of suffering that Jesus went through. 5 specific experiences. The first experience of suffering that Jesus went through was that Jesus suffered the mocking of the soldiers. The mocking of the soldiers. Look at verses 16 to 20. They put a royal robe on him. Now, in order to understand this story, you have to understand what we already learned, that Jesus was accused of being the King of the Jews. And when he said that, to Pilate, "That's what you say," that became the accusation against him. For the Jewish people, it was deserving of death because they thought it was blasphemy. But for the Roman people, they didn't understand why there was such a problem, because there was nothing deserving of death in that statement. So that's what they're talking about. The accusation is the King of the Jews. So what do you do if somebody thinks that he's King of the Jews? Well, I would like to suggest to you that the soldiers thought that Jesus was a French fry short of a Happy Meal. He wasn't quite all there. So they mocked him. They severely mocked him. So much so that they went out and they bought a purple robe. Why purple? Because a purple robe was what a king wore. And they went out to mock this, quote unquote, King of the Jews. And they put a purple robe on Jesus. "There's your king." And they were mocking him. They weren't out to worship him. They weren't interested in paying him honor. They were mocking him. Then it says that they twisted together a crown of thorns. This is a crown of project put together. I think Marcia put it together, right? And I don't know if you can see. Do you see these thorns, how long they are and how sharp they are? These are from an orange tree. And whoever's had this might have been bigger than me. But can you imagine it smaller? And it's all, this is used with tape, but can you imagine it all being natural, and these severe thorns being crushed into a person's head who has already been beaten. Why? Again, to mock him that he was king of the Jews. So he was going to wear a purple robe and a crown of thorns. And they call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews! Hail, King of the Jews!" They were calling out to him as if he were a king, but obviously they thought he wasn't. After a purple robe was put on him, and this thorn was put on his head, and he was bleeding, and after they called out, "Hail, King of the Jews," I want you to understand that they hit him. And I don't think you can understand that they just tapped him on the shoulder. They beat him. They hit him. They struck him on the head. Wait a minute, what about the head is bad? He had the crown of thorns on his head. If they're striking him on the head when he's wearing the crown of thorns, that crown of thorns is being hammered into his head, if you would. And the blood is just gushing out. Not only did they strike him on the head, they spat on him. I don't know if you've ever been spat on. I have. And it's a very, very humiliating thing. They spat on him. And then they fell on their knees to pay homage to him. Please don't misunderstand this. This isn't genuine homage. This isn't truly honor. This is mockery. They're pretending to pay honor to the king. And then it says, they took the purple robe off him. They were finished their game, and now they were going to go back to work. They led him out to be crucified. So number one, Jesus suffered the mocking of the soldiers. Can I ask you a question? Have you ever shied away from sharing your faith because you didn't want to get laughed at or rejected? Let me tell you, you've never been mocked like Jesus was mocked. And if Jesus was willing to be mocked for you, shouldn't we be willing to be mocked for him? Think about it. Jesus suffered the mocking of the soldiers. Number two, Jesus suffered the weight of the cross. John chapter 19, verse 17 tells us that Jesus carried his own cross. Our text here tells us that the soldiers forced Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross. Which one is true? And the answer is, they're both true. Why? Because in this emaciated, beaten condition, Jesus is carrying the crossbeam of the cross, and Jesus is so weak that he falls beneath the weight of the crossbeam. He can't handle it anymore, not because he wasn't a man, but because he was beaten and persecuted so badly. So he falls to his knees under the weight, and somebody else has to bear the cross for him. Why do you think Mark tells us that it's Simon of Cyrene? Do you know where Cyrene is? It's in Africa. This was an African man carrying Jesus' cross. And why do you think that Mark tells us that his sons were, is it Alexander and Rufus? Is that right? Why do you think he tells us that? If you keep on reading in your New Testament and get to Romans chapter 16, don't skip the names. We skip the names so quickly. One of the leaders in the church in Rome, Romans chapter 16, verse 13, is Rufus. And Rufus was there seeing his dad carry the cross. And now Rufus was carrying the cross as a believer. Mark's letting us in on this. Tom Shepard wrote a beautiful hymn, and it goes like this. Must Jesus bear his cross alone, and all the world go free? No, there's a cross for everyone, and there's a cross for me. The weight of the cross. Jesus suffered the mocking of the soldiers, the weight of the cross, but thirdly, Jesus suffered the agony of crucifixion. They brought him to the place of the skull. Why was it called the place of the skull? Some people say that it was called the place of the skull because there were skulls on it of other people who had been crucified, but I don't think that's the point. The place of the skull had the privilege of being there. The place of the skull, when looked at from a distance, is a rock formation on the side of a hill that looks like the eyes and the nose and a face. That looked like a skull. And on top of that hill, one preacher called it a spectacle on Skull Hill, Jesus was crucified. They took him to the place of the skull. Otherwise, their word for it was Golgotha. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh. Why would you mix wine with myrrh? This was a sedative to lessen the pain. But I want you to notice what happened. Did Jesus say, "Oh, it's about time you gave me this something to take my pain"? No, he didn't. Jesus refused to take the sedative. Why? Because Jesus was willing to bear the shame of being mocked and the pain of being crucified because he loved you. And he was taking your place, your pain, your shame on himself, and he didn't want to miss out on any of it. He took the pain. And it was excruciating. By the way, that word excruciating is where we get cross from. It was out of the cross, excruciating. Jesus took the full pain. And they crucified him. Mark says it so simply, but sometimes we forget what it means to be crucified. Crucifixion was a method of painful death. It was invented, as far as they know, by the Romans. What they would do was they would have this long beam in the ground and another beam to go like this across, and then they would take the guilty man's feet and put him like this without shoes on. He was naked. And they would put a nail through his ankles, to both ankles. A long nail. And then they would put a nail in both hands. And he was basically hanging there like this. And the problem is, when you slouch down because you're tired and you can't support yourself anymore, you have to push up on your wounded feet in order to breathe. So you push up on your wounded feet, and it's excruciatingly painful, but you have to take a breath. And you do that a few times, and then you give up and it's over. That's what Jesus went through for you and for me. He went through being crucified. And then they cast lots for his clothing. That was their tip for doing their job well. They got to get the dead guy's clothes. Jesus suffered the mocking of the soldiers. He suffered the weight of the cross. He suffered the agony of crucifixion. And fourthly, Jesus suffered the miscarriage of justice. Look at verses 25 and 26. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. Why is that important? Do you remember when they arrested Jesus? They arrested Jesus at midnight. This is 9 hours later, and they're killing him. And their law said they could not kill a man until they had a 24-hour time of reflection to see if they had made the right decision. And they didn't even wait 24 hours after he was arrested, never mind after he was convicted. Jesus endured the miscarriage of justice. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. He had been arrested in the garden only 8 hours later or earlier. This was illegally fast work. And the charge against him was posted, the King of the Jews. Another gospel tells us that the Jews didn't like that. They said, please rewrite it and say, he said he was the King of the Jews. And Pilate says, what I have written stays written. In other words, phooey on you guys. And then number 5, Jesus suffered more mocking and insults. He's had an unjust trial. He's been mocked by the soldiers. He's experienced the pain of the cross. But even as he's dying on the cross, they're still mocking him. Look at verses 27 to 32. The soldiers crucified Jesus between 2 rebels. Verse 27. One was on his right hand and one was on his left. Do you know why they did him in the middle? Because they wanted to associate him. They didn't want to have 2 criminals and the King of the Jews. They wanted to imply that the King of the Jews was a criminal. Isaiah said he was associated with the wicked in his death. Not only did the soldiers crucify the 2 rebels, but the 2 rebels started insulting him. Look at verse 32. This is what they call a Mark sandwich. Mark starts with the rebels, doesn't talk about them all the way through until he gets to verse 32. And then he says, the two rebels were insulting Jesus too. What does he say in the middle of that? Well, those who passed by hurled insults at him. And what were those insults? One of the insults was, you who were going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. What are they doing? The people who are hurling insults remembered the trial. It's only a few hours back. And they remembered the false accusation against Jesus at the trial was that they misunderstood what he had said. Jesus had said that if you destroy this temple or tabernacle, talking about his body, I will raise it again in 3 days. They misunderstood what he said, thought he was talking about the temple in Jerusalem, and said, oh, you think you're such a good guy that you can wreck the buildings of the temple and fix them in 3 days? Let's see you do that, you King of the Jews. They were mocking him. And the fact was that Jesus was being destroyed at that very moment, and he would be back in 3 days. Then they said, come down from the cross and save yourself. Do you know, I believe that Jesus could have saved himself if he had wanted to. There's a song that says, he could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he died alone, and he died for you and me. Jesus could have come down from the cross, but if he came down from the cross, he wouldn't have accomplished his purpose. And God's purpose for him was so that we could be saved. If he saved himself, he couldn't save us. But if he saved us, he couldn't save himself. He couldn't have it both ways. And he chose to die alone so he could save you. That's love. But they're making fun of him. Not only did the people who passed by make fun of him and insult him, the Jewish leaders mocked him. Verses 31 and 32. He saved others, but he can't save himself. And as I said before, he didn't save himself because he wanted to save us. Let this Messiah, King of Israel, come down from the cross, and we may believe, see and believe. Those guys wouldn't have believed if Jesus came down from the cross and slapped him in the face. They were set against Jesus, and they were determined to kill him. They had no interest in believing. They were just mocking him. So Jesus suffered a lot. Jesus suffered the mocking of the soldiers, the weight of the cross, the agony of the crucifixion, the miscarriage of justice, and more mocking and insults. Bernard of Clairvaux put it well. What thou, my Lord, hast suffered was all for sinners' gain. Mine was the transgression, but thine the deadly pain. If you are here this morning and you are not yet a Christian, the punishment that God demanded for our sin was on Jesus. The punishment that you and I deserved, he decided to take for us. The punishment that Jesus paid in full is able to set you free. You don't have to pay for your sin. You don't have to pay for your foolish behavior. You can be set free. You can be forgiven. You can be bound for heaven. If you will simply say, Jesus, thank you for what you did on the cross. Thank you that you did it for me. Please, Jesus, forgive me. I accept you as my Savior and my Lord. If you would like to pray a prayer like that, this is what we call a time of invitation. It's a simple time where if God has spoken to your heart, you can respond by just coming forward. I'll turn my mic off so we can be private and we can pray together about whatever God is speaking to your heart about. Maybe you need to become a Christian. Maybe you already are a Christian and you need to make something right with the Lord. Or maybe you want to get baptized or join our church family. Whatever God is speaking to you about, when I talk to you about the cross, that is what you have